"Get this pauper away from the table," my daughter-in-law said, lifting her hand slightly as if she were adjusting a bracelet instead of summoning security to remove me from my own family dinner. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The country club ballroom was glowing in soft amber light, crystal glasses catching the reflection of chandeliers that probably cost more than my first house. A string quartet played something gentle and forgettable near the bar. Around me, men in tailored suits and women in sleek evening gowns paused mid-sentence. Conversations thinned into a brittle silence. I was already seated when it happened. I had just smoothed the navy silk of my dress and placed my clutch beside my plate. I remembered noticing the place setting: gold-rimmed china, 3 forks, 2 spoons. My name not printed on the card in front of me. That should have told me something. Instead, I assumed it was an oversight. After all, this celebration was for my son, Daniel. His company had just secured a major expansion deal, and tonight was meant to honor his success. I had been there 10 years ago when that success was nothing more than a sketch on a legal pad at my kitchen table. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, poised and immaculate in a cream-colored gown that looked effortless in the way expensive things often do. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "She's not on the seating list," she told the event coordinator, loud enough for the table to hear. Then, with a tight smile that never reached her eyes, she added the word that settled over me like frost: pauper.
2 security staff in dark suits approached, polite but firm, their expressions professionally blank. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, not from shame, but from disbelief. Pauper. I glanced down at my hands. The pearl bracelet on my wrist had belonged to my mother. My wedding band was modest, worn thin after 42 years of marriage. Nothing about me glittered. Nothing about me shouted wealth. Perhaps that was the point. I turned my eyes to Daniel. He avoided them at first, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. My son, who once cried when he scraped his knee at the playground and insisted I be the one to carry him to the car. My son, who had stood in my driveway at 27, voice shaking, asking if I believed he could really build something of his own. I had believed in him when the bank did not. I had believed in him when investors called his ideas unrealistic. I had believed in him when he believed in nothing but his own exhaustion. "Mom," he said finally, his tone low and strained, "maybe let's talk about this outside." Outside. As if I were the disturbance. As if my presence at a table celebrating the company I helped keep alive was an intrusion. I adjusted my necklace. I inhaled slowly. The quartet continued to play, though one violinist kept glancing toward us. At nearby tables, people looked down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their salads. Vanessa gave the slightest nod to security, a queen granting permission. I rose from my chair without argument. The silk of my dress whispered against the floor. If they expected a scene, they would not get one. I have learned that humiliation delivered in public is often meant to provoke desperation. I felt neither desperate nor small. I felt something colder, something clearer. As I stepped away from the table, I let my gaze rest on Daniel one last time. He looked uncomfortable, not cruel. That almost hurt more. 10 years ago, I signed documents in a quiet attorney's office to make sure his dream had room to breathe. Tonight, at a table set with gold-rimmed plates, my daughter-in-law had reduced me to a single word: pauper. I walked toward the exit with steady steps, aware of every eye that followed me. They thought they were removing an embarrassment. They did not yet understand what they were about to lose. I did not drive home immediately. Instead, I stood on the stone terrace outside the ballroom and let the cool Connecticut air settle against my skin. The sounds of the party filtered through the tall glass doors behind me, muted laughter and the soft clinking of silverware, resuming as though nothing unusual had happened. I have learned that rooms recover quickly once the discomfort is removed. I walked past the valet stand without saying much, handed over my ticket, and waited beneath the tall white columns at the entrance. My sedan pulled up within minutes. It was not flashy, not new, but it was fully paid for. I thanked the young man who opened the door for me and slipped into the driver's seat. As I eased out of the circular driveway,
I caught a final glimpse of the ballroom through the windows. Vanessa was already smiling again, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor scheduling error. The drive home took 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard with a steadiness that surprised me. Streetlights passed in measured intervals. My reflection in the windshield looked calm, almost detached. I expected tears. They did not come. Instead, my mind moved backward, not to the insult, but to the beginning. 10 years earlier, Daniel had stood in my kitchen at 2 a.m, exhausted and unsure. The house still smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink because he had been revising his business proposal for hours. Investors had turned him down twice. The bank had declined his loan application. He said he needed $200,000 to get through the first year. I remember placing my hands flat on the oak table and asking him one question: "Do you believe in it?" He said yes. I believed in him. 2 weeks later, I sat in an attorney's office and signed documents that transferred a significant portion of my retirement savings into a structured investment agreement. I also agreed to secure a line of credit against my home. It was not a gift. It was an investment placed into a trust that protected both of us. Daniel had insisted on that part. He said he did not want to take advantage of me. I told him that believing in your child is not being taken advantage of. When Vanessa entered his life, she admired his ambition. She admired the rapid growth, the new office space, the invitations to private events. What she never asked about was the first year, when Daniel drew no salary and ate microwave dinners at his desk. She did not ask who covered the payroll during a slow quarter. She did not ask why the company documents listed a silent partner under a family trust. As I turned into my driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. The house looked the same as it had for 38 years. White siding, blue shutters, the maple tree Daniel used to climb when he was 12. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet. Inside, the grandfather clock in the hallway would be ticking. The kitchen counters would be clear. No string quartet, no crystal glasses, just stillness. I stepped out the car and walked up the path slowly. The night air carried the scent of cut grass. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I removed my heels and placed them neatly by the entryway. The silence did not feel heavy. It felt honest. I walked into the kitchen and ran my fingers along the edge of the same oak table where Daniel once mapped out his future. People use the word poor as if it means lacking value. I have never measured wealth in chandeliers or seating charts. I measured it in sacrifice, in risk, in quiet faith when no one else was watching. Upstairs, in a small fireproof safe inside my study closet, there were copies of the original trust documents and the most recent quarterly reports. I did not open them that night. I did not need to. I already knew what they said. Down the hall, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times. At the country club, dessert would be served about now. Vanessa would be raising a glass. Daniel would be thanking investors. And somewhere between the applause and the speeches, he might begin to wonder why the only person who ever believed in him without conditions was not at the table. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the way I always do. Habit does not change simply because your place at a table does. I brewed coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the pale light settle over the backyard. The maple tree cast a long shadow across the grass. I remembered Daniel at 8 years old, insisting he could climb higher than the neighbor boys. He always wanted to prove himself. I sipped my coffee slowly and let the quiet guide my thoughts. I did not feel rage. I felt clarity. After breakfast, I walked down the hallway to my study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lavender polish. On the top shelf of my closet, behind a row of neatly folded blankets, sat the small gray safe. I knelt, entered the code without hesitation, and opened it. Inside were copies of the trust agreement, shareholder allocations, and the most recent quarterly statement from Whitmore Strategic Solutions. My name was printed clearly under majority beneficiary of the Founders Trust, 51%, a silent majority, structured that way on purpose during the first year when Daniel feared losing control to outside investors. The arrangement had been temporary in theory. It became permanent when expansion required additional capital, and I agreed to reinvest dividends rather than withdraw them. I sat back on my heels and closed the safe gently.
Vanessa had never attended those early meetings. She joined the picture when the company already had polished branding and catered lunches. She admired the visible growth. She never asked about the foundation.
Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the desk. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded careful, as if he was stepping across thin ice. He said he was sorry about the confusion at the event. Confusion. I repeated the word quietly, tasting it. He explained that Vanessa had been under stress coordinating guests, and that there had been a misunderstanding with the seating arrangements. I did not interrupt him. I let him finish every sentence. When he asked why I had left without speaking to him privately, I told him that there was nothing private about what had happened. Silence settled between us. I could almost hear him recalibrating. Then he asked if we could meet later in the week. I told him I would check my schedule. That seemed to surprise him. For years, my schedule had revolved around his. After we hung up, I dialed another number. Thomas Caldwell had been our attorney since my husband passed away. He answered on the second ring, warm and professional. I asked him to review the current trust provisions and prepare a summary of my rights as majority beneficiary. He did not ask for details. He never does. By noon, an email arrived outlining the voting authority attached to my shares, including the power to halt the upcoming expansion initiative pending review. I printed the document and placed it neatly on my desk. Outside, a delivery truck drove past, ordinary life continuing at its steady pace. I ran my fingers over the printed pages, not with triumph, but with resolve. I had never wanted control. I wanted security for my son. Last night, security had escorted me out of a room that my faith helped build. The irony did not escape me. Wealth is often mistaken for glitter and noise. Real power is quiet, structured, signed in ink years before anyone thinks to question it. I folded the summary carefully and returned it to the safe. I did not make any sudden decisions. I did not need to. Patience has always been my advantage. At some point, Daniel would realize that tables can be rearranged. What he had not yet realized was that ownership cannot.
2 days passed before Daniel came to the house. He did not call ahead. I saw his car pull into the driveway just after 4 in the afternoon, sunlight reflecting sharply off the windshield. I was in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie I did not particularly need to bake. The rhythm of the knife against the cutting board was steady, controlled. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door without rushing. He looked tired, not defeated, not angry, just unsettled. He stepped inside and glanced around the foyer as if measuring the distance between the boy he used to be and the man he had become. The house had not changed. The framed photographs still lined the hallway. His graduation portrait hung beside his father's military photo. The grandfather clock marked each second with quiet precision. "Mom," he began, his voice softer than it had been on the phone. "Vanessa feels terrible about what happened." I studied his expression carefully. He said she feels terrible. He did not say she is sorry. There is a difference. I invited him into the kitchen and poured him a glass of water. He declined coffee, which told me he did not plan to stay long. He spoke about perception, about the importance of image in business, about how certain investors expect a particular atmosphere at formal events. He explained that Vanessa had been trying to maintain standards. Standards. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question. "Do you believe I embarrassed you?" He hesitated. That pause lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it was long enough. He said it was complicated. I nodded. Complicated is what people say when they do not want to choose a side. I walked to the hallway and returned with a thin folder. Inside were copies of the original trust documents and the most recent financial summary. I placed them gently on the kitchen table between us. "Do you remember signing these?" I asked. He recognized them immediately. I saw it in the way his shoulders shifted. He explained that he had always intended to restructure the ownership once the company stabilized. I reminded him that it had stabilized years ago. I reminded him that I never insisted on changes because I trusted him. Trust, I have learned, is quiet. It does not demand applause. He looked down at the pages for a long time.
Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street. The ordinary hum of suburban life continuing as if this conversation were insignificant. "What are you saying?" he asked finally. I folded my hands on the table. "I am saying that I will not be treated as an inconvenience in something I helped build." I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I simply stated a fact. I explained that as majority beneficiary, I had the authority to delay the upcoming expansion vote until I felt comfortable with the direction of the company. His eyes lifted quickly then. There it was. Not fear, awareness. He understood what delay meant in the world of investors and deadlines. "You would not do that," he said quietly. I met his gaze without anger. "I have never acted against your best interest," I replied. "But I will act in mine." The air between us felt different after that. Not hostile, clear. He gathered the documents carefully, as though they were fragile. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. "Vanessa did not know about the trust structure," he admitted. I nodded once. That, too, was complicated. After he left, I returned to the kitchen and slid the pie into the oven. The scent of cinnamon began to fill the room. Some things require heat before they settle into their final shape.
The pie cooled on the counter long after Daniel left. I did not cut into it. I let the cinnamon settle into the air, warm and steady, the way patience settles into a person who has learned not to react too quickly. The following morning, I received an email from Thomas Caldwell confirming that a formal notice could be drafted at any time to postpone the expansion vote. He outlined the process in careful, measured language. There would be no drama, no raised voices, just procedure. I printed the email and placed it beside the original documents in the safe. By midweek, word had traveled, not publicly, not in headlines, but quietly among those who paid attention to ownership structures and voting rights. I know this because Daniel called again, this time earlier in the day. His tone was different, less defensive, more aware. He informed me that several board members had reached out asking for clarification about the trust. It appears that when investors research stability, they examine foundations. Foundations sometimes have names attached. Mine was one of them. That afternoon, Vanessa called for the first time since the dinner. Her voice was composed, but there was an undercurrent beneath it, like wind moving under a closed door. She said she would like to clear up misunderstandings. I agreed to meet her at my house on Friday at 3 o'clock. I did not offer to drive to her.
When she arrived, she stepped out of her car in a tailored blazer and neutral heels, dressed as though she were attending a board meeting rather than visiting her mother-in-law. I invited her inside and led her to the living room. She glanced around, taking in the framed photographs and the polished wood floors. Perhaps she had never truly seen this house before. We sat across from one another with a small glass table between us. She began by explaining the pressures of maintaining image, the expectations of donors and partners, the importance of perception in high-level circles. I listened. When she finished, I asked her whether she knew how the company survived its first 18 months. She admitted she did not know the details. I told her about the line of credit against my home. I told her about the nights Daniel spent rewriting projections, while I calculated how long my savings would stretch if the venture failed. I did not exaggerate. I did not accuse. I simply described facts. Her posture shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. "I never meant to disrespect you," she said carefully. I believed that she believed it now. Intent, however, does not erase action. I told her that respect is not a performance reserved for investors. It is consistent. It does not depend on guest lists or lighting. I informed her that the expansion vote would be paused until I felt confident that the leadership of the company reflected the values it claimed publicly. She inhaled slowly, calculating. I could see her mind adjusting to a new structure of reality, one in which influence did not sit where she assumed it did. Before she left, she asked what it would take to move forward. I answered plainly. Transparency, acknowledgement, and a seat at the table that did not require permission. After she drove away, I stood by the front window for a moment, watching the late afternoon sun stretch across the driveway. Power does not need to be loud to be effective. It only needs to be understood. Inside the house, the grandfather clock ticked steadily, each second measured and patient.
Outside, the world continued at its usual pace, unaware that the balance of something important had quietly shifted.
By Monday morning, the shift was no longer subtle. Daniel called to inform me that the board had agreed to postpone the expansion vote pending a structural review. He chose his words carefully, as if he were speaking in a meeting rather than to his mother. I thanked him for the update and asked when the next board session would be held. He said Thursday at 9 o'clock. I told him I would attend. There was a pause on the line, followed by a measured acknowledgement. After we ended the call, I walked into my study and selected a charcoal gray suit from the closet. I had not worn it in years. It was tailored, understated, the kind of clothing that does not demand attention but holds it anyway. I scheduled a car service rather than driving myself. Not for drama, for intention. Thursday arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze. The office building stood tall and reflective against the morning light, all glass and steel, a monument to growth. When I stepped into the lobby, the receptionist looked momentarily uncertain before recognizing my name. Recognition travels quickly in professional spaces. I was escorted to the conference floor without delay. The boardroom was modern and quiet, long walnut table polished to a sheen, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Daniel stood near the head of the table. Vanessa sat 2 seats to his right. Conversations softened as I entered. I did not rush. I took the seat nearest the center, not at the edge. Thomas Caldwell was already present, reviewing a thin stack of documents. He nodded once in greeting. The meeting began with financial summaries and projections. Numbers moved across the screen in neat columns. Revenue growth, projected margins, international partnerships. When it was time to address the expansion vote, Daniel cleared his throat and acknowledged the trust's majority position. He explained that leadership review and governance alignment were necessary before proceeding. The language was professional. The meaning was clear. I listened as each board member offered commentary. Some expressed surprise at the ownership structure. Others admitted they had never examined it closely. That is the nature of silent support. It is appreciated until it asserts itself. When Thomas invited me to speak, I rose slowly. I did not use notes. I explained the origins of the trust, the intention behind it, and the principle that growth without respect for foundation becomes fragile. I spoke evenly, not as a parent correcting a child, but as a majority stakeholder outlining expectations. Transparency in leadership, defined communication channels, a formal acknowledgement of founding contributions. No dramatics, no references to dinners or embarrassment. Business language, measured tone. When I finished, the room remained still for a moment. Then one of the senior board members, a man who had joined during the second funding round, nodded thoughtfully and said, "Stability begins with clarity." Others agreed. Vanessa remained composed, but her expression had shifted from dismissal to calculation. She understood that authority does not always announce itself in the room where it began. The vote to delay expansion passed unanimously, not because of force, but because of structure. After the meeting, Daniel approached me near the windows overlooking the city. His voice was quiet. He said he had underestimated how much the foundation mattered. I told him foundations are easy to ignore when the building looks impressive. He did not argue. As I left the building, the wind moved lightly against my jacket. I felt no triumph, only balance restored. Some lessons arrive loudly. Others arrive through governance documents and measured silence. The difference is maturity. And maturity, unlike image, cannot be staged. The city looked different after that meeting. Not larger, not smaller, just clearer. When the car service dropped me back at my house, I did not feel like I had won anything. I felt as though something had been placed back where it belonged. Inside, the afternoon light filtered through the living room windows, landing softly on the framed photographs along the wall. I paused in front of one taken nearly 15 years ago. Daniel stood beside me at a community business award ceremony, his arm around my shoulders, pride bright in his expression. There had been no investors then, no formal boards, just belief and risk. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice carried less tension this time. He told me the board members had expressed appreciation for the clarity of governance. He admitted that several of them had privately questioned how much influence Vanessa held over company decisions. I listened without judgment. It is not pleasant to realize that admiration can quietly turn into doubt. He asked if I would consider taking on a more visible advisory role,
at least temporarily, to stabilize perception. I told him I would consider it under one condition. Respect would not be negotiated behind closed doors. It would be visible. Not dramatic, just consistent.
The following week, a formal announcement was drafted outlining the structure of the Founders Trust and acknowledging my role as majority beneficiary and early investor. The language was professional and measured. There was no reference to family dynamics, only to stewardship and continuity. Vanessa reviewed the statement before it was released. When she came to my home that Tuesday afternoon, she carried herself differently, not diminished, grounded. She spoke of partnership rather than presentation. She admitted that she had focused too heavily on image and not enough on origin. I told her that image fades quickly when foundation is ignored. She nodded once, accepting the truth without argument. Later that week, Daniel invited me to lunch at the company headquarters. Not a public spectacle, a simple meal in the executive conference room. When I entered, the staff greeted me with polite acknowledgement. Word travels efficiently in professional environments when authority becomes visible. Daniel pulled out a chair for me, a small gesture, but deliberate. Vanessa arrived moments later, composed and respectful. No exaggerated warmth, just acknowledgement. During the meal, Daniel presented revised governance guidelines, clear reporting channels, defined roles, transparency in decision-making. I listened carefully, asked a few measured questions, and offered adjustments where necessary. The tone of the room was not tense, it was balanced. After lunch, as we stood near the window overlooking the city skyline, Daniel spoke quietly. He said he had confused success with distance. He thought appearing independent required minimizing the source of his foundation. I told him independence is strongest when it honors what built it. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the glass buildings. The company would continue. The expansion would resume once alignment was confirmed. There would be new investors, new projects, new headlines. But something essential had shifted. Authority no longer sat quietly in the background. It stood, visible and calm. When I returned home that evening, the grandfather clock chimed 6 times. I set the table for one and placed my napkin neatly beside my plate. Wealth is not measured by who is invited to dinner. It is measured by who understands their place at the table, and for the first time in many years, that place was clear.
The expansion resumed 3 weeks later, but this time it moved differently. There were no hurried announcements, no dramatic press releases designed to impress strangers. The strategy documents were reviewed line by line. Risk assessments were revised. Governance language was clarified. I attended each meeting quietly, offering perspective only when necessary. I did not dominate the room. I did not need to. Authority, once recognized, rarely needs to raise its voice. Daniel began arriving at my house every Sunday afternoon, not out of obligation, out of habit rediscovered. We sat at the same oak kitchen table where his first business plan had once been scribbled in pencil. He would bring coffee from the small shop near his office, the one that still uses ceramic mugs instead of paper cups. We spoke about market forecasts and long-term sustainability, but sometimes we spoke about simpler things. The maple tree out back needed trimming. The porch railing would need repainting before winter. Conversations that once felt distant slowly found their way back to ordinary ground. Vanessa joined us the following month. She arrived without presentation, wearing jeans and a light sweater instead of tailored suits. She helped clear the table after lunch. She asked questions about the early years of the company, about Daniel's father, about the night I signed the trust documents. Her tone was not defensive. It was curious. There is a difference between protecting image and building understanding. I noticed that difference immediately. One afternoon, Daniel suggested hosting a small leadership dinner at the house. Not at a country club, not under chandeliers, just a simple meal for the executive team to discuss the next phase of growth. I agreed under one condition. The guest list would reflect contribution, not status. When the evening arrived, I set the table with white china that had belonged to my mother. Nothing extravagant, just clean lines and polished silverware. The executives who attended were respectful, attentive, perhaps slightly surprised by the setting. Daniel introduced me not as an investor, but as founding partner and steward of the trust. No hesitation, no qualifiers. The room acknowledged it without spectacle. During dinner, discussions moved naturally between projections and principles, transparency, long-term responsibility, sustainable expansion rather than aggressive acquisition. I spoke briefly about resilience, about the importance of remembering who carried risk when outcomes were uncertain. There were no uncomfortable silences, only thoughtful nods. After the guests left and the dishes were washed, Vanessa stood beside me at the sink. She dried each plate carefully before placing it back into the cabinet. "I understand now," she said quietly. I did not ask her to elaborate. Understanding does not require repetition.
Later that night, as I turned off the kitchen lights, I thought about how easily perception can distort reality. A word spoken in a moment of pride can echo longer than intended, but so can structure built in patience. The company would grow, markets would shift, trends would change, but the foundation had been clarified. Authority no longer hid in background paperwork. It stood openly, calm and defined. As I walked down the hallway, the grandfather clock marked another steady hour. Years ago, I had signed documents believing in my son's future. Tonight, I watched him lead with awareness rather than distance. Respect had not been demanded, it had been established. And establishment, unlike image, does not fade when the lights dim.
Autumn settled gently over Connecticut that year. The maple tree in my backyard turned a deep shade of amber, its leaves falling in quiet spirals across the lawn. Daniel once mowed for $5 a week. The company moved forward with its expansion, but at a measured pace. Quarterly reports were clear. Board meetings were deliberate rather than rushed. My advisory role became formalized, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a defined position within the governance structure. I attended meetings twice a month, sometimes in person, sometimes through secure video conference from my study. I never spoke first. I listened. I observed. And when I did speak, the room paid attention without hesitation. Daniel changed in small ways. He began introducing me at events without gloss or explanation. "This is my mother, Margaret Whitmore, founding partner," he would say, steady and direct. There was no embarrassment in his voice, no attempt to soften the title. The first time he did it publicly, at a regional leadership summit, I noticed Vanessa watching the exchange carefully, not defensively, thoughtfully. Later that evening, she stood beside me near the buffet table and said, "I underestimated what quiet strength looks like." I appreciated the honesty more than an apology. In the months that followed, the house regained a rhythm it had not held in years. Sunday dinners became consistent again. Sometimes the meals were simple, roasted chicken and green beans, sometimes more elaborate when guests were invited. There was no performance in those gatherings, no posturing. The table felt balanced. I did not need to assert my place. It was understood. One evening, after Daniel and Vanessa left, I walked through the house slowly, turning off lights one by one. I paused in my study and opened the gray safe once more. The trust documents were still there, carefully arranged. I ran my fingers lightly over the folder before closing it again. I did not consider transferring ownership. Not yet. Stewardship is not about control. It is about timing. Outside, the air carried the first hint of winter. I stood on the porch and watched the sky darken. Wealth, I realized, is often misinterpreted. It is not chandeliers or guest lists or who sits closest to the head of the table. It is the ability to remain steady when others mistake silence for weakness. It is the discipline to act through structure rather than impulse. The word that once echoed in a ballroom had lost its weight, not because it was retracted, but because it had been disproven by reality. Respect had not returned through confrontation. It had returned through clarity. The company thrived. Daniel matured. Vanessa adapted. And I remained exactly who I had always been. Years ago, I believed in my son when belief was risky. Recently, I believed in myself when respect was tested. Both required patience. As the grandfather clock chimed 10 times that night, I felt no resentment, no lingering sting, only certainty. Tables can be rearranged, titles can be polished, but ownership, when built on sacrifice and foresight, does not disappear simply because someone chooses not to see it. In the quiet of my home, surrounded by memories that predated success and would outlast it, I understood something simple and unshakable. I was never removed. I was always the foundation.